So welcome everybody to our October colloquium. We've been a bit quiet here during the summer. We had our conference, which was, I think, fairly successful, we could say, back in August. We're very honored to welcome Professor Greg Eghigian. Greg is Professor of History and Bioethics at Penn State University, specializing in the history of science and medicine. Greg has written extensively about the ways in which scientific and medical institutions have understood and treated those deemed mad, abnormal, or delinquent. Prior to, correct me if I'm wrong, Greg, prior to your book on the UFO phenomenon, your most recent book had been the Routledge History of Madness and Mental Health. Greg serves on the editorial boards of the periodicals Psychiatric Times and the Journal of the History of the Behavioral Sciences, and is co-founding editor-in-chief of the scholarly blog H Madness. And of course, as we all know here, more recently, Greg has turned his attention to the history of the UFO and alien contact phenomenon, which I believe is the sort of topic that you're turning to very soon in book form, research for which he has received funding from NASA, the American Historical Association, the American Philosophical Society, and the Smithsonian National Air and Space Museum. And today we're speaking about his, I would say, long anticipated text on the global history of UFO and alien encounters, which has been published with Oxford University Press, a prestigious press indeed. And Greg is presently, among other things, of course, is presently working on a book that chronicles the history of the alien abduction phenomenon, something that, of course, you touch on in this recent text, which you're going to speak about today. Greg, it is an absolute honor. You are a member of the Society for UFO Studies. You're helping stabilize this sort of discourse as an academic affair with the appropriate measures of scholarly distance and objectivity, etc. But today, you're going to bring us inside and discuss after the flying saucers. Thank you, Greg, and please, the floor is yours.
Thanks very much. I'm going to be sharing my screen with you all in a bit to talk through some things. I want to thank Mike for doing this. Any number of you have sort of given me advice along the way. That includes Mark, and I'm very grateful for Mark joining in and directing comments and questions and the like. It's always interesting for us historians when people who have been not only lived through many of these things, but have actually played a directive role in them, are there to sort of talk about things and correct mistakes, but also maybe enhance things that I just simply gloss over very quickly. What I'm going to do today is not summarize the book. I'm going to make an assumption that you all have at least had the chance to maybe look at it, glance over a chapter or two. Maybe some of you have read it all. So I thought I would not do that. I thought instead what I'd do is just very quickly sort of go over what I learned, or some of the lessons I learned in approaching this, how I got to tackle the project, some of the things I found out along the way that surprised me. I won't cover everything. And then at the end, Mike had recommended that maybe I could lay out some of the things that I think might be next for conducting the history of the UFO phenomenon and UAP in general. And I'll do that, and then I'll hand it over to Mark, and then hand it over to all of you. So let me try this now. Okay, grant access. What do I have to do? I have to grant access to something. Google Chrome, maybe. Okay, or Zoom. I should have done this ahead of time.
Oh, Greg has disappeared. There you are. You're muted.
Let's try this again. Window. Aha, there we go. That should work. Is that working, Mike?
Yeah, we see it. Yeah.
Okay. Okay, great. Perfect. So yeah, what I want to do, as I said, I'm going to just talk a little bit about the project. So, you know, I came to this as somebody who, you know, in part accidentally through some related interests. I talk about this in the preface to the book about how I came to this. I'm no stranger to interest in this phenomenon, having grown up with it and read deeply into it. Though I sort of put that off to the side over many years. So this was a form of revisiting the topic. But when I started to consider diving into it, I, of course, immediately had to start thinking about what is going to be my contribution. How am I going to say something different, something new, and hopefully something enlightening? And frankly, one of the things that became clear to me from the bat that I did not expect was to find out that my fellow academic historians hadn't really been writing about this. You know, David Jacobs' 1975 book was the last time an academic historian had written a kind of an attempted an overview of the subject. There were some articles here and there that historians have done, but largely historians had neglected this, and that struck me as both an opportunity but also a bit of a problem for me that maybe I'll get into in a bit. But in any event, when I dove in, it became clear to me right from the get-go that so much of the way people thought about and talked about the phenomenon was really divided into two groups, right? The true believer who was absolutely convinced that UFOs not only were real, but they were probably extraterrestrials. Of course, other arguments are going to get thrown out over time, but primarily extraterrestrial in origin. And then, of course, the diehard skeptic, the debunker, who says absolutely not. This has all sorts of other explanations. This is nonsense. It struck me that on one hand, any history was going to have to appreciate both of those voices, in the sense you were going to have to write the history of both of those ways of talking about this. But it also struck me as something that was kind of neglected, was what the two sides, if you want to call them that, had in common, which is they kind of approach this stuff from a kind of forensic standpoint, as a puzzle, as almost a crime scene that needed to be investigated. And we needed to come to a conclusion about what really happened, who's telling the truth, and all of this. That is what's kind of dominated the way of talking about this, even for many academics. It seemed to me that something else was needed, and particularly given the fact that the UFO phenomenon has been way more than just simply about sightings and about reported sightings. It's been about so many different things. It's touched so many facets of life. It's been a global phenomenon. It's a part of news cycles and magazines, but TV shows, music. It relates to all sorts of other kinds of paranormal phenomenon. So it's not something that could easily be put into just a simple box. And it seemed to me that if I was going to sort of take this on, what I needed to do was to understand all this other stuff. The stuff as I sort of sometimes rib our natural science colleagues about, right? All the noise that they want to eliminate in order to get to the truth of UAP. I consider the noise actually the signal. I'm interested in the noise. I'm interested in the culture of it all. And that was, to me, the central thing. Now, the question was, how was I going to do this? How was I going to write about a topic that in which, in fact, the very phenomenon itself is up for grabs, right? Is something that people are questioning and discussing. And I needed an inspiration. And I found, I think, my inspiration in somebody I consider one of the greatest historians of all time, Carlo Ginzburg, and particularly his 1966 book, The Night Battles, came to mind. One of my favorite books. I teach it all the time. If you don't know it, I recommend reading it. It's utterly fascinating. The long and the short of it is it's a peculiar story about how, and it follows this over many years, but it begins really with around 1580, when a peasant in Friuli in northern Italy by the name of Paolo Gasparuto gets on the radar of the Inquisition. Never a good thing. And he gets on their radar. And because he is saying to people that during certain sacred days, he and some other people meet, they go out into the woods, they fly around, they engage in battle with other sacred beings. All of this stuff, of course, smacks of witchcraft. And so the Inquisition is very, very nervous about it. So they take him in, they get him, and they start to interrogate him. And they say, well, so do you really do this? He says, oh, yeah, absolutely, I do this. So you are a witch. He's like, no, we're not. I'm not a witch. I'm one of the Benendanti. And the Inquisitors are absolutely baffled. They're like, I've never heard of the Benendanti. Who are the Benendanti? He says, yes, we go out during these sacred days, and what we do is we all get together. There's about 5,000 of us across Europe, and we go and battle the witches. We protect the crops. And the Inquisitors are like, this, you sure you're not a witch? What do we do about this guy and about this group? Is the group real? Are they really out there flying? Do they imagine they're flying? And so Ginsburg sort of tracks the way in which the Inquisition tries to make sense of this thing that doesn't fit any of their standard narratives. But it also becomes a question for Ginsburg himself, because he has to ask himself, okay, maybe I want to entertain whether or not he was truly one of the Benendanti, but maybe more of the social dimension of it. Did this group even exist? Were there people who at least imagined they were doing this? Were there actually meetings in the woods? He doesn't know. And so there's a lot that isn't known. It struck me, his approach to writing that narrative, to writing how people at the time grappled with this sense of uncertainty, this lack of knowledge, these things that didn't quite fit existing paradigms. That struck me as an inspiring way to go about this. So I had to start asking myself, where do I go? And of course, I'm a historian. I need sources. Well, where are they? Who has them? That, of course, was the central thing. I'm used to working with a lot of governmental archives. It's pretty simple, but libraries and archives have not tended to have the kind of keep the kind of materials that made up the world of UFOs following World War II. So where was I going to get them? And that's the first lesson I learned. I learned about ufologists. I learned that ufologists don't throw away anything. I learned that the people who study UFOs over the many decades, they are natural-born archivists and historians. They have all of these things, and they keep these things. And for me, one of the key places where I did my research was here at the Archives for the Unexplained in Sweden. I had 2 lengthy research visits there. This was before they were doing the major digitization of a lot of their records that Isaac Coy has remarkably done on his own. But they're extensive records from all over the world, literally all over the world. If you ever get a chance to go out there to do some research, I highly recommend it. Those people are wonderful, and they were wonderful to me. And so that's what introduced me to all this ephemera: newsletters, books, magazines, correspondence, artwork. These are some of the images I took of materials that were sent to ufologists in the Soviet Union in the late 1980s. some of it really, really quite remarkable as people tried to capture what they said they saw at these moments. Of course, there's audio materials that are available. Wendy Connor's archive of audio materials are absolutely spectacular. I feel like I've only scratched the surface of some of these old, particularly old radio programs from the 40s, 50s into the 60s. I get letters from people all of the time, like this one here from this very nice gentleman. We exchanged information several times, and he sent me this rendition of something he saw once. I know all of us are probably familiar with this, because once people know you sort of work in this area, you get people who want to communicate with you about it. So that's been extremely helpful. I've been to my UFO conventions, right? And met people, had a chance to interview some folks over the years as well. So all of that has been part of it. I've had my share of strange things that have happened. One of them was this that I received early on. So I had a friend and colleague of mine who, when he found out what I was doing, he said, you know, I've got a bunch of materials that I'll send you because I think you'll know what to do with them. And he sent it to me and I didn't get it for many weeks. And then finally, I get this package with all of this all over it. And it actually has stuff inside it, but it's really bizarre. Because if you look, I've never received anything in the mail ever once with this many stamps on it, with mutually contradictory things in it about receiving it unsealed, received without comments, damaged in handling, media mail subject to inspection, received without contents. There were contents in it. It was absolutely bizarre. So the second lesson I learned pretty quickly was this stuff is very weird. It's going to be weird and get weird. But here's the thing. Don't assume people involved are. Take everyone seriously. Take everybody who I talk to as serious as they want to be taken. Now, of course, people who are pranksters and hoaxsters, they may not want to be taken seriously, but that's perfectly fine. I take them seriously as hoaxsters and pranksters. But that to me was a really important thing to take into consideration right from the get-go. Of course, we all know when this sort of modern phenomenon, this contemporary phenomenon of UFOs takes place, it starts generally with Kenneth Arnold's sighting. I've had, of course, plenty of folks who know a lot about the history who said, oh, that's really, I don't know why you begin there, or I don't think that that's the starting point. There were other sightings earlier. Why don't you start with this date, or why don't you start with Foo Fighters, or go back to Charles Fort? I do go back in time, as you know in the book. But for me, the key thing was to focus on the moment when this crystallizes into a larger social phenomenon. And without question, it only does that once you get the moniker of the flying saucer, right? Something that gets developed through headlines, right? And we know that within 6 weeks of Arnold's sighting, we know that this term flying saucer, right, they get labeled that within just about what, 24, 48 hours after his sighting. It becomes, we know from a Gallup poll done 6 weeks later, that 9 out of 10 Americans know this term and are aware of this term. And so that became very clear to me that another lesson I had to learn right away is how important the media was in how this phenomenon sort of took off, took shape, and became part of really a global conversation. Now, something else to me was kind of critical was to see then how this thing that became a media sensation already in the summer of 1947 now became something else. And I think the two books that struck me as very pivotal, and the year that strikes me as very pivotal, I make that argument in the book, is 1950. It's the publication of Donald Keyhoe's The Flying Saucers Are Real, the publication of Frank Scully's Behind the Flying Saucers, because this is when we get two writers who piece together what was, I think, fairly fragmented ideas, speculations, sightings, and reports that are there right, in those first 2 to 3 years of the phenomenon, piece it together and bundle them up into compelling narratives, right? Donald Kehoe's being, right, that the US Air Force has been studying this stuff. It's concluded that these things are extraterrestrial in origin, that that these are highly advanced civilizations who are likely performing reconnaissance, and that the US government is keeping it a secret, right? Because they're afraid of starting a mass panic. And of course, Scully's book talks more about captured flying saucers, right? Retrievals that have been done, bodies of occupants of these things have been recovered, these kinds of things. And so one of the things I quickly also became aware of is how important stories were, how sightings and reports get bundled and packaged into compelling narratives. None of this is to say that the sightings are inaccurate, that the reports aren't true. None of that is to do that. It is to say, however, that what happens is we have always had to make this sensible in some ways. And the way human beings tend to make sense of things is through stories. We tell stories to each other, we craft stories. Story making was going to be really the centerpiece, therefore, of the book. It's the history of the stories we tell and we have told ourselves about what it is we are engaging with. And I would argue that even if you're doing a statistical analysis, you're still telling a story. And of course, the stories are more, it's more than stories. It's more than just that. Because the other thing that became very clear to me as I started to see the ways in which people responded to this phenomenon by creating organizations, by getting together and talking about it with other people, it becomes very clear that people almost right away start to seek out other people who are interested in the phenomenon or who share certain kinds of speculations over and above other kinds of speculations. Here, of course, George Van Tassel, who I talk about in the book, and his meetings that begin, I guess, what is it, 1954 at Giant Rock in California, the first, or as he liked to call it, the first and the biggest UFO convention, right, in which people would travel from all over to hear people talk about hear from contactees and hear from other people, but also to just get together and talk and trade stories, exchange speculations, sell their wares in some cases. And this is one of the things that it became very clear as I started to do deep dives into the literature and to look at some of the records, is the way in which people were looking for opportunities to share their ideas, to find ways to express them, and to get together with other people who might strategize about what to do with it. That includes, by the way, the debunkers, right, who themselves also start to they only late in the game start to get organized, but they too feel this need to sort of have some kind of solidarity and to get together in groups. And that, I thought, was really became clearly the fifth lesson that I learned, was that the UFO mystery has historically been an invitation. It has been a very open-ended, in large measure, very inclusive kind of phenomenon socially and culturally, because it's offered people something to get on board with, to chime in, right? The UFO world has always been fairly capacious, and it's been fairly solicitous. It's been a place where people could generally find a home. And for those of you who've been doing this for many years, and if for those of you who haven't done it for many years, but if you talk to people who've been around for a long time, the thing they will always tell you is how many great friendships they've made over these many years of their involvement in all of this. And so I thought that one of the things that I needed to show in the book was that instead of the portrait of UFO interest being sort of sparked and ignited and inspired by fear, anxiety, paranoia, which is there, I'm not saying it's not there. I think what's been neglected is the other side, is that how much it's been enthusiasm, excitement, that has really, I think, been very much behind what motivated people and has motivated people over the decades. Of course, there have been these moments when interest in and sightings, of course, have popped up. 1952, Washington, D.C., of course, being one of the big ones. I talked some about that particular sighting, but other people have gone into it in far greater detail than I have, and so I sort of leave it up to others to sort of do that. But you can see sort of the ways in which the U.S. Air Force at the time, this is from, I think, if I'm not mistaken, it's from Ruppelt's book, about trying to figure out if those sightings in some fashion might have been triggered by news media coverage. This is from Dallaire's, I have this image in my book as well, from Dallaire's examination of the 1973 wave of sightings, a really, really important year as well, in my estimation, and some of the patterns that seem to emerge. But this is something I think I showed in my first presentation to this group at the first annual conference, was some research I had done about articles with headlines about UFOs and flying saucers over the years. I think we may have talked about it then, and we can certainly come back to this if folks are interested, with the interesting spikes that seem to pop up every 10 years. If you notice, I'd done this before 2017, and I dare say, right, if we had included, if I hadn't gone as far as, say, 2020, I'd say we'd see a very big spike around 2017 and 2018 as well. But we could sort of talk about that. But in any event, that's another, of course, lesson that I learned, was that if sightings have typically come in flaps and waves, so has interest in them. And part of one of the other things that became necessary for me was to try to help understand the nature of the sort of media ecosystem, of how it is that things become, reach a sort of certain critical mass of great concentrated, intensive interest in the subject, and how at times it just fades away, right? And that, of course, got me to appreciating the role that all sorts of different figures have played in the phenomenon. Of course, the other thing is the major thesis has always been, at least since 1950, the major focus has been on this idea that this phenomenon, and behind this phenomenon is something extraworldly. And the most common argument, even to this day, is, of course, that it's extraterrestrial in nature, right? That advanced civilizations from other worlds are behind this. It's important, I think, though, to keep in mind that when you look at this idea, right, it's an idea, of course, that's part of popular culture. But it's an idea that's been around for some time. I mean, and certainly Steve Dick, the historian, has shown, I think, pretty compellingly, right, that human beings, as far back as ancient history, have clearly taken seriously the idea that we are not alone in the universe. It's been explored in science fiction and the like, but that various people have claimed to have said that they engaged with aliens of one kind or another. There in the middle is a story that I talk about in the book of Helena Smith, a clairvoyant at around the turn of the 20th century, who's from Switzerland, and who worked closely with a French psychologist who claimed to have been sort of spectrally transported to Mars and met Martians there, including this figure there on the left. So that was another thing that I thought was something that I think a lot of people have not understood and appreciated over the years, is that for most of the history of UFOs, this has not been the image of an alien, right? That this very, very famous portrait from Ted Seth Jacobs, is that it? Or Ted, I don't want to get his first name wrong. But anyway, Jacobs, who worked an artist who worked closely with Whitley Strieber on the book cover. This, of course, has become the kind of iconic image of the gray. It's the iconic image that also has deeply influenced a lot of people to come forward to say that they, in fact, had similar encounters as his. But it becomes important then, I think, historically, to unthink those things and to really take seriously then these other kinds of ways in which aliens have been thought about, aliens have been speculated upon, aliens have been experienced in one form or another. And now, getting close to my conclusion, here we are in the present day since 2017, right? I don't need to sort of point out who all of these images refer to and what they referred to. They're all very familiar to all of us here. And in many ways, they may well have been the thing that sparked Mike's phone, sort of get involved and to create the organization that we're all a part of here. To me, the interesting thing is, you know, what do we see? We see whistleblowers or self-professed whistleblowers, journalists who are writing articles that sort of tell us that something secretive, that some mystery is going on, photographic and filmic evidence that is quite perplexing, that leads people to sort of argue for one point or another point. The thing for me that I think is quite striking is that all of this is part of a world. That in many ways, one of the things that maybe we often don't acknowledge nearly enough is how the UAP operates as a social world, as a world populated with all of these figures. And in fact, it sort of gets at the heart of my book, because I do, in fact, make the argument that the UFO phenomenon, the flying saucer phenomenon, is as much about all of the people, the groups, the organizations, the theories, the ideas, the beliefs. All of those things are part of that world, part of that phenomenon. And they can't be just simply extricated from the phenomenon itself, because we, human beings, are deeply, deeply sort of baked into it, right? How could it be anything other than that, I think, would be my argument. But in any event, that aspect of it, that the UAP is a social world, and it's a social world that, in my estimation, is not altogether unique. We are not. I think I might have made this point back in my first presentation to this group. You know, maybe it's the historian's mantra in large measure. We're not as original as we like to think ourselves. And all you got to do is, again, and I know Mark is one of these people who's been around the block a long time. You keep hearing a lot of reinventing of the wheel over and over again. There's a sense of kind of a recycling of notions, recycling of ideas, but they're oftentimes not even recycled. They're visiting things that have already been discussed, sometimes ideas that have already been tried out and then abandoned, right, that come back. In that sense, perhaps not unlike academia, but it is one of the things that makes up, I think, the UFO phenomenon. So finally, to end my comments, I'm going to sort of take Mike up on, who asked me to maybe say a few things about what I'm working on next, and then also maybe any new directions I think that might be intriguing when it comes to at least the history of the phenomenon. I am working on a number of different projects. I have to say I try to divide my time in doing them. So some are more advanced than others. Some are basically ideas and little more than that. I have finished a piece that need to just finally tie up in a nice little bow on the history of names and name calling in UFO studies. Some of you have seen versions of this of a presentation I gave at Alex Wentz workshop or conference some time ago. But an interest I have in what struck me was particularly this emergence of this language of UAP, how it emerged, why it emerged, and what it sort of triggered in my mind was how the history of ufology and the study of UFOs has been so stamped by debates over what it is one is supposed to call this thing, if it is even a thing, right? How do you go about that? And how have names played a role politically in sort of determining the truth or what's supposed to be the truth about the phenomenon, but also who gets to speak about it? I'm working and supposed to be working with Christian here on the history and politics of disclosure. I've been kind of interested in it, but I will admit I'm also been very sheepish about it because I feel it is those are very, very deep waters. But much like the book, I don't claim to want to write the final chapter of it, but rather I want to try to look at some of what I consider to be kind of the influences and the themes that have come out in how this concept of transparency and disclosure has played out in the UFO world and how it might relate to other kinds of versions of this in the late 20th century. A paper proposal, right, that I know Mike Uhal, you know about this because I've proposed this for the volume you and Mike are talking about putting together. But I'm interested in maybe doing something that I consider for me would be ambitious, which is to maybe lay out what are the challenges, but what are also the opportunities in thinking about methodology when it comes to writing the history of UAP and more broadly UFOs in general, right? Well, what are the things that are stumbling blocks for the historian? What are the things that make this different than other kinds of phenomena? But also, what can we learn from other challenging chapters in history that historians have taken on that might help us inspire us to other kinds of ways of approaching the topic? And then what Mike referred to, the book project I'm working on is a history of the alien abduction controversy. Mike's quite right. As you know, in the book, the final chapter is about alien abduction. I don't really plan to go over that territory that much. What I'm really interested in is looking at the controversy surrounding it and what it might reveal about how this phenomenon sort of brought out and intersected with other really major topical issues at the time that seemed to speak to questions of trust, questions of expertise, question of authority, questions about belief, and ultimately questions about the politics of experience. I am right now actually a research fellow at Princeton, and one of the obligations I'm doing we have is to present papers to the Davis Center seminar there, the history seminar, which I will be doing in about a week and a half. Of a paper I've just finished with, which is my first sort of foray into thinking about this controversy. Unfortunately, I cannot share it with people at this stage because I really need to get feedback from these historians. But maybe down the road, this might be something I'll be able to present to this group. Then finally, where could this history of the phenomenon go from here? And here's a few ideas I think that are important. First of all, the historian in me will always say we need archivally based, thick descriptions, as historians and anthropologists put it, right? Really empirically sound efforts at capturing the voices of participants at any given time and understanding them in their full context, rather than taking them out of their context and simply using them for and instrumentalizing them for the purpose of some other agenda. I did this global history as best I could. Because of its nature, it is superficial at best about a lot of the things I talk about because I'm trying so much to incorporate a lot of international trends. What I know we need a lot of is more local and regional histories. We need people who can and know locales and know the characters, know the institutions at the regional and local level for events and incidents, who could really tease out the information and start to capture some of that kind of micro history that Carlo Ginzburg wrote over the course of his career that I admire so much. Oral history, I think, is critical. We have a lot of folks around who are getting on in age, who've seen a lot, experienced a lot, know a lot. We need oral histories from these people. I don't possibly have the time. There are people who've been doing it. Jan Aldridge, I think of right away, in Project 1947, have been doing this all along. But we need people, anthropologists, sociologists, historians, really getting interviews with people. Biography strikes me as a very promising channel, an opportunity that we don't have enough of. Sound, empirically sound, critical biographies, things that aren't hagiographies, that aren't hero worshiping or attempts to sort of do just the opposite, right? To debunk people and make them look foolish. We could use some great biographies that are done, like I say, in a scholarly fashion about all sorts of people, whether that's Bud Hopkins or who I think of really warrants one is Coral Lorenzen. And now that we've got some of these records from APRO coming online for us pretty soon, maybe that's possible. I think social roles, to talk about these kind of figures, right? These social types who pop up all the time in the history of UFOs, whether they're whistleblowers or the maverick scientists, whether that's James McDonald, right? Or Avi Loeb, the witness, right? I think we could do some really intriguing things with these kinds of figures. The leitmotifs that keep popping up all the time in the story of UFOs, time and time again. And what these things mean, how these things have been understood over time and changed over time. I think we need some science, technology, and studies research on a lot of things that, to me, are not problematized enough. STS scholarship is sophisticated, it's thoughtful, it's shown us the ways in which our technologies and scientific methods are deeply, deeply sort of entwined within a lot of human cultural and social history in ways that we often don't acknowledge. I think a lot of these things that I cite here could be incorporated into that. And then finally, I know near and dear to the heart of everybody from Alex went to Christian here, politics, the politics and how politics are involved. And politics, not just simply in terms of government. I'm thinking here, if we understand politics as power relations, we need to think about how internally politics are played out. Why it is that certain institutions have more cachet than others, or how the inner workings of certain institutions, whether that is a government UFO desk, right? Or it's something like the Sol Foundation, right? Or Avi Loeb or SETI, or Avi Loeb's project at Harvard, or whether SUAPS itself, right, is subject to its own politics, right? Politics is there. It's a dimension of any institution and organization. All of these things, I think, need to be thought about in historical terms and how the history of all that plays out. All right, I think that ends my remarks. I went on way too long. I did not want to go on that long. Anyway, I'll stop sharing, and thanks very much.
Thanks, Greg. The first political statement is that I am apolitical. So. Thank you very much, Greg. Quite brilliant. I've got notes here, so much to think about, so much to talk through, but the floor is turned over to Dr. Mark Rodeghier. Dr. Mark Rodeghier, of course, as many of you know, is the director of Alan Hynek's sort of legacy project at this point, the Center for UFO Studies, and also a colleague of ours at the Society, and someone with whom I've been for several years now. I guess it's been three or so years, have been in constant contact and conversation. Dr. Rodeghier, please, the floor is now yours.
Thanks, Mike, and thanks, everybody. Hey, Greg, that's a marvelous lecture. I very much appreciated it. Laying out your thoughts, the background of the book, intricacies of the book, working as an historian in the field. Really fascinating to me, and I'm sure to everybody. I really appreciate that. I am UFO history, aren't I? I have lived almost as long, not quite, almost as long as the modern era of UFOs. I've lived into what I call the new modern era of UFOs, which is, of course, post-December 2017. And I've worked in the field for about 2/3 of the current era, frightening as it is. But it's really, it's an odd experience, not quite out of body, and really a wonderful one to have somebody as scholarly, as thoughtful, and informed as Greg write about something I've been involved with so closely all my life. And so I have some thoughts. I have a couple of questions for him. And I appreciate very much, as he said, that this book could not be a deep dive on the global history of the phenomena, though there are a couple of areas where I think you did do that. But instead, it's a broad survey that's critical. In fact, here's really my first lesson. I like, Greg, your lessons, and here's wasn't going to couch this as a lesson, but I will now. All of those who are new to the field should read this book, because people need to know the history of a subject to fully understand what they're involved with. They also should read the papers that are produced, not just in history, of course, in all the different areas, whether it's religious studies, scientific papers, looking at trace cases and so forth. But that is so critical and so lacking here. I'm looking at you, Lou Elizondo, or many others we could think of. So that's number one. So critical. My second lesson, and Greg, you do this, and I correctly so, but I would have almost liked to see a bit more of it, is the focus on the witness, the focus on the person who is the source of our data. With rare exceptions, 98 to 99% of our data comes from people, fundamentally. And we all recognize that. Greg writes about it in his book and has accounts of what people say. I still get reports, obviously, at the center all the time with original reports from people that still see things. But it's that fundamental mystery that's been there. In other words, UFOs, UAP, they're a mystery for the public. They're not just a mystery for me, for academics. That is what they are. And yes, we've helped make it that in many ways, but still that really is what it's come down to. And the subject is wildly diverse, as Greg correctly described, in its organizational forms and how it's been approached by governments, whether it's behind the Iron Curtain in the Soviet Union or before that. It's been, or South America with the hairy dwarfs versus other areas in the world. I mean, it's incredibly diverse in ways that now people can read about in one spot. Greg talked about the difficulty of sources in this field, that we save everything. I wish we saved everything. There are several collections that have been lost over the years, including some of Alan Hynek's papers. We won't get into that. But nevertheless, we save a lot, including the new archive in Albuquerque. But people can't get access to those easily. And so, I never underestimate what people's knowledge is or isn't. Another area, this comes from my sociology training and interest in institutions in that sense, is how weak the institutions have been in the field. We've been nonprofits or just unincorporated groups and individuals that have been trying to get the attention of, I use the word the establishment without pejoratively, just simply the establishment, meaning science, politics, big media, and you know, to take your pick, individual scientists in general. And so we're people like myself, Dr. Hynek, Maynard, have been trying to get the attention of those, and it's not easy when your institutions are weak. It's also not easy to corral people you're working with. You know, Greg talked near the end of his presentation about the politics of the field and the people in the field and all that. We were well aware. Of course, we're well aware of that, and we had nuanced views of, and Greg wasn't suggesting otherwise, that we have very nuanced views of things, and also a hierarchy within the field is important to note. It's not that people like at the center or the Society for Scientific Exploration or some of the good European groups like the Italians and the Australians, it's not that they rejected completely the side of UFOs that was more interested in the esoteric and all the rest, but it's they basically we talked amongst ourselves, the people who were more serious, because, well, you know, what else would you do? So okay, those were just some comments. Now a few questions for Greg before we let everybody else chime in. So I'd like to hear if you have another lesson for us, Greg. For SUOPs, for academic societies and people who are academics who are trying to approach this subject in the standard manner. So you've now taken a deep dive in this in many ways. Is there something informed on the history, one or two things that you would say people who are a part of SUOPs, who are part of the Sol Foundation, even SCU, you know, what can they take away from this to do their job better? That's not kind of trite, but to basically say, okay, this is what happened in the past. Let's therefore not repeat those mistakes, or let's do this in this way that is more likely to be successful for us. So,
oh boy, that's a good question, right? Yeah, the next lesson, so to speak. I'd say the first thing is to recognize. The first thing I would say is, and this is in a sense something that I get a sense is a lesson that veteran ufologists have known for a long time anyway. It's the new generation that need this reminder, which is don't get caught up in the hype, right? There are so many, this phenomenon has been associated with so many fads, so many people who pop up on the scene and promise disclosure tomorrow, or we have this great new evidence, or we have that this has happened so often and so many times. It is really simply just part of now. It makes it easy to see why people would understand this all as really the stuff really more of myth making and legend than anything that has any legs. So what I come away from this with for an organization like ours, and but for anybody doing it seriously, is understanding the lesson that comes from the study of something like science, right? The history of science, which is that progress tends to be slow. Conclusions are always qualified. And thirdly, it's a process, not a thing. Science, I always tell my students, science is a verb. It's a verb, not a noun. It's about this process. So you embrace a thoughtful process. You always ask yourself and question yourself along the way. And then you make sure that you understand and integrate the criticisms that might come from others, but also that you might have, and doubts and questions you yourself have. Integrate that into your knowledge as well. So it seems to me it's about something that unfortunately in the 21st century we don't seem to have much patience for, but that is patience. we need take a slow approach to this and to say, you have to be in it for the long game. It's about the long game. And Mark, I think you hit it so on the head when you talk about the weakness of institutions. The problem has been because without solid, stable funding resources or an institutionalized life within the establishment, as you put it, it's very hard to be about long game. You're always chasing funding. You're always trying to get the media's attention, and the media's attention is not long. You know, I was just this past week talking with a guy who specializes, he's a historian, works with places like the Washington Post, Time Magazine, and is in charge of funneling historians to speak about public issues, you know, and more generally. And he made this point that I said, I know exactly what you're talking about because I've experienced it, which is that you want to maybe write something for the media, right? For a big newspaper or magazine. And the bottom line is they're going to want to know, well, how does this relate to the here and now? I want to know I don't want to know about, oh, this is an interesting topic. No, I want to know, tell me how this matters to a reader today, right? Says this is why I don't tell people, don't write anniversary articles. It's the anniversary of this. He says that doesn't affect people's lives. What about what happened yesterday that makes what you're doing relevant? But keep in mind, in 2 days, that's no longer relevant. So it is something that if we're going to approach it and think about it in this way, it has to be slow, cumulative, involving a lot of patience and a lot of hard work. Yeah.
Thanks. First, I want to look down at my notes here. I want to comment and say that one of those areas in the book where you did go into great depth, and I can tell you're interested in it because you're going to be writing another book on it, is the abduction phenomena. And it really was a critical episode. And I almost say episode because, as I think we all know, abductions still occur, but the interest in them, the number of people working on it has just diminished, you know, greatly in the field. And we could talk about that another time. But it really was something that caused a great shift in focus, a rift between people. You know, I switched what I was working on to do a study on abductees, and then did another study on that because it seemed, you know, that's what you do in science. You look at the current topics that are of interest. And it also led, actually, as you detail, to the most the most focus on a UFO topic by the Academy that's ever occurred in the 90s, when the several journals covered this and there was continuing focus on it. There were books about it, like McNally and so forth. And even though I disagree with some of their conclusions, you know, the key thing is all we want is academics in the greater world to take an interest in this, and they did. You know, and there's still stories to be told, and Greg and I know this because of the mailing list that we belong to, where Michael Swords has been doing deep dives on the Ted Blocher archives, what was going on behind the scenes in the 70s with him and Dave Webb and Bud Hopkins, and really fascinating stuff that I'm sure will end up in a book at some day by Greg. So anyway, so great on that. Now, that said, let me ask you, it's going to be a two-part thing. There's an area that you actually really barely alluded to in the book, UFO crashes and retrievals. And Roswell appears once or twice with the word, but, you know, the story is not recounted. I'm not saying that I agree or disagree, but I would like to know, what was the decision to not cover that topic, even at a glancing blow?
Good question. I've been asked that before by folks who are very disappointed, right? And we might even expand this because we can get into my discussion about which nobody ever asks me, but I'll ask myself the question is like, what do you think you neglected you should have had in the book, right? Because there are some things. or different things I didn't focus enough on. But yeah, so Roswell, for instance, crashes and retrieval. I don't think I mentioned Area 51 at all.
Right.
That's
I don't
not
think
in there.
so, yeah.
And I will give the very, it's going to sound cavalier, but it's not cavalier. Probably the number one reason is just simply trying to fit everything in and not knowing how to do it. Part of it with both of them, of course, as you well know, you know, if I'm viewing this from, again, this perspective that I do, which is as a social phenomenon, Roswell isn't terribly important, right, for many decades. It simply isn't a part of the big conversation, as you know, until you get to, what is it, the late 70s when...
Oh, even
when
into really more the late 80s. Really.
Late 80s,
Yeah.
right, it's the late 80s. Area 51, I think, doesn't enter the conversation until around then, right? 70s at the earliest. But so neither of them are very much a part of the general conversation. Roswell is kind of interesting in the sense that for a few days, it's a worldwide phenomenon. And then it just disappears after you know the Air Force comes out and says, "Oh, nothing to see here," kind of thing. So I don't do much with that. I you know the cattle mutilations and things in the 70s. I also just sort of talk about in passing. So part of it was my reasoning was that it seemed to me that it was these were phenomena that don't get really part of the conversation and play much of a big role until much later on. And then by the time, of course, I get to that point where it starts to play a role, that's when alien abduction sort of takes all the oxygen out of the room. Not to say these things are unrelated, but it does sort of get at what I didn't do enough of. I do think one of the things I do talk about it does come up at times. I do think I don't take on enough of, and that's where Roswell and Area 51 fit in, is I don't do nearly enough about the growth of certain conspiracy theories, you know, and the disclosure movements. I mean, it's in there, but I don't do it as such. And I think I could have done more with that. And I would say the other thing that I think I might have done more on is, you know, I did in the early chapter, I talk about the nature of how much air traffic there was in the late 40s and early 50s relative to what had been the case up until then, as something relevant to the context of saucer sightings, right? What I didn't do is have enough of a conversation about the ubiquitousness of balloons and the new technologies, right? And the use of balloons for both obviously military surveillance, but also for meteorology purposes, right? Which plays a very, very big role. That I neglected, and that I'd say is an oversight on my count. So yeah, there are things I have not included. But yeah, Roswell, somewhat deliberate, but mostly it became then a question of where just quite to fit it in.
Yeah, I can understand. I'll just add to what you said. This thought, the Roswell and related crash stories, I think could have included, but the angle would have been that they led to the two new reports by the U.S. government related to the crash. The first time the U.S. government had officially said anything about UFOs since they closed Project Blue Book. And so that development alone was something that was noteworthy in the history of the field. And in fact, to your general point about abduction sucking the air out of the room, they did to a certain extent, but in fact you showed that nice diagram you said we could go back to about press coverage and basically really declining, with a few spikes declining over the years since you began it. One of those spikes was the Roswell stuff. It wasn't abduction stuff. It was the Roswell related coverage. But so what was going on then, and we were rather annoyed by it at CUFOS because it really detracted from a more broader scientific focus was the Roswell and abductions. Now, my last point, because I know people have lots of questions and thoughts, is related to the new modern era. Okay. First, a comment from me, from everybody. Those Navy videos would have had little to no impact on Congress, on the media, and on the public if there hadn't been a UFO phenomena that they were standing on. That all this history that Greg wrote about. They would have just been one-off videos. They would have been intriguing. Nobody would have done much of anything, and people wouldn't have got excited about it. So everything that's happening now rests on this giant superstructure of the UFO phenomenon and history and all that's going on there. So that said, like the question for Greg, history is a continuum, but then they're punctuated equilibrium, like blanking on our paleontologist Stephen Gould said, all right, punctuated equilibrium. So and this also it's a two-part thing, but it relates back to the thing about question about Roswell, is that now in these hearings, David Grush, other people like that are talking about disclosure, technology, things that are going on, black projects, all of this stuff. That goes back to, what does that rest on? Well, why is that even plausible? Because of all the stories that people have talked about before of recoveries and disclosure and so forth. So, but as an historian, do you see how different do you see the last 6 or 7 years compared to the history before that? Is it fundamentally different in your view, or no? It's there's still a through line there.
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, I see, like most things in history, I always joke that when I talk to the media, and I talk to journalists, and they want to ask me these questions along these lines, the historian, basically, we have only one of two ways we answer the questions. One is, there's nothing new here, this is old hat. The other, this is unprecedented. Those are the two contributions we can make to conversations, apparently. And maybe that is the case. But I think so. I do see it both ways. What I would say is there's a lot that's not new here. You put it really elegantly about this phenomenon of the recent attention being built on really the shoulder of giants, giant events, giant figures. I don't know how much Avi Loeb knows about James McDonald, but the two have a lot in common. It strikes me when I look at the two side by side. So there's all sorts of examples of this. In some ways too, I find we've gone in a straight line back to the beginning in many ways, because so much of the conversation reminds me of the 1950s, that we're interested in nuts and bolts objects, right, and what they're made of, and their source of energy, and what shapes they are. It's like
and
right?
NICAP pushing against the Air Force.
It's like old NICAP days. It's really old school, which is kind of cool. It's part of what I like about it. On the other hand, I do think there's some new things, and again, people have heard me say this before, so bear with me. I won't go on at length about it, but I think the two things that strike me as different is the way in which the intelligence services in recent years have come forward and said these things are real. People are seeing real things, right? That these aren't optical illusions, these aren't computer glitches. Something is there. Now, they have kept saying we don't see any reason to suppose any reason for these to be extraterrestrial in nature. But nonetheless, that is not the kind of stuff that typically went on back in the day. The other thing is I have always contended that, to me, the most interesting thing is not Arrow and the intelligence people. It's NASA. It's the civilian scientists saying, hey, there's something here. There's something worthy of study. We give it our stamp of approval for folks to do it. Now, of course, everybody's waiting for the funding sources. When the NSF starts funding projects, then maybe we'll take it seriously. But that to me is momentous, right? NASA never would have come close to UFOs back in the Werner von Braun days. He loathed this stuff, right? Considered it all superstitious hogwash, right? So that to me is a very momentous change for people who are interested in studying this stuff in a serious, sober fashion. Yeah.
Yeah, thanks. All right, Mike, I will turn it back to the group.
Okay, thank you. We have a short queue, but anyone is really welcome to raise your hand. So Christian, of course, you have your hand, but we also have, after Christian, we have a rather long comment and question from our colleague, Michael Uhal, who can't speak it. He's indisposed. So Christian, and then I will read this comment question. So Christian, please.
Hi, thanks. I have to run off soon, so it's great that I got the chance to ask that first. First of all, Greg, again, it's been, and also Mark, I think that has been a great combination of, well, asking about the elephant in the room questions, but also the both of you having developed, well, either through lifetime or through professional obsession, the longue durée that this discussion needs, and that brings me to a question. Now it's not a real question. It's something like a very immature hypothesis I've been sitting on, which looks at the discussion of the UAP topic in a sense through the lens of a sociologist of religion, because what you could say is that, of course, the UFO topic is about, even in the nomenclature you have it about, it's about anomalous phenomena that are, to a certain extent, contradicting the main paradigms, be it in the natural sciences, or be it in even in the social sciences. Again, I totally support Greg. The point that we've made is that the social sciences probably are not going to make any decision on any ontological discussion of the UAP topic. But what we can do is we can observe certain homologies. And if you look at if you take it as some sort of a nascent religion, I'm not saying it's a religion, but it has in it, the sense of being the heterodox with respect to an orthodoxy that manifests in society and the sciences. And isn't it, because you have, in a sense, complained about the ahistoricity of ufology and the UFO movement in itself, isn't that maybe caused by that concerning too much about certain patterns of reappearance, even after 1947, would kind of disenchant the spontaneous, moment of something that happens totally anew? Because the observation that I have made, I hope that my thought is not too complex, and can you still follow, Greg? It's okay? Okay, but the point that I've been observing is that right now we're in this phase where evidently, something happens in academia and more people are chiming in, and there is interest, that there are magazines, new books coming out. And I think we're really seeing something that Mark has called the modern, how have you said?
New modern era.
The new modern era.
Yeah.
And I'm really fascinated by how many of those people that are running into the field right now, solid philosophical backgrounds, like massive academic training, and they're really, there's the first paper they will publish will be on ultra-terrestrials or something like that, where I think, okay, man, you're jumping over a long trajectory of solid questions that ufologists that were on the science side of things have been dealing with. And I wonder if it's just the attraction of the heterodox that kind of brings people in, but that also makes them to a certain extent ahistorical. I think if you're establishing something new, you cannot be too much about history. That's basically the observation that I would see here. And if you see that there are some sort of analogies in the UFO discussion, because it seems to me that a lot of stuff just reappears, and we're at the point at the moment where I think we've been historically before.
That's a very, I've never heard that before. That's a really intriguing line of thinking, and I really have to digest it and explore it more with you. There's something very alluring about this idea about the heterodox being maybe feeding into an ahistoricity. That said, I feel like being ahistorical or thinking ahistorically is in a sense a human foible. It's always there. I mean, we human beings as a society particularly, we forget, and we forget very quickly. Right? And so in a sense, one of the roles that I was just talking about this with some colleagues just a few days ago was in a sense what historians, what we do on a regular basis is remind people about things we've forgotten multiple times over. It's why we don't get invited back to parties. We're always the killjoy. But this is what we in a sense do, is say no. So I think there's this desire, no question, to naturalize things, and in that sense, you could make the argument that both scientifically minded people and people who view UFOs or the phenomenon in terms of religiosity and spirituality share that in common. a predilection toward naturalizing and reifying something as either sacred or profane, but in any event, it's that, right? And I come from a field that generally pushes back against naturalizing things. It tends to sit there and say, it's a little difficult to do that, or this our knowledge about this isn't nearly that stable. But so I'd have to give it some thought, but it's a really intriguing idea. Yeah.
I can, if I can just make a footnote on that, and it's not to be thought only in the context of the sacred or the secular, but I think there are also a lot of, I mean, you could probably say that Avi Loeb's decision of not considering old data and starting with something new has as much to do with a scientific rationality as it has to do with an awareness about the burden that a certain historical trajectory brings in. So in that sense, I really think that if you start a new religion, you should not consider about how the old religion has served the people's needs too much. You have to really start with, and the religion here is only the metaphor. It's not saying that like the UAP topic is about religion only. I think there are homologies at work here that we might not even be aware of. I asked that Alex Wendt, and he seemed to be very surprised. I told him, maybe you like it so much because you're a very secular person, and believing in alien overpower gives hope for eternal life. I don't know. That's very blunt now, but you get my point. But I think there is good reasons to start and restart new stuff when it's so much at friction with the ruling paradigm. But thanks a lot, Greg, and goodbye, and see you.
Bye. Take care. Yeah.
I was just going to jump in. I mean, Christine, if you have to go, it's fine. But I mean, the religious dimension is there, but I mean, why would one be motivated to see that because of the heterodoxical element, I guess is my question. What's the relationship between that? I mean, because there's heterodoxy in science, and that doesn't crystallize into a religion per se. So I would wonder about those two things. A, B, there is something new. I think the historian, the trick, right, with the historian is that to not make everything seem as if it were a repetition, but within the repetition to see new elements emerging and to clarify exactly the extent to which and the nature of that newness. And that's actually, I think, perhaps the as Greg mentioned, this is kind of the task in a way of the historian, is not only to look at the past, but to see that in fact there are openings that are new here, which forms the basis for a history going even forward that is not just merely a repetition. And we could talk more about that. And then C, one has to be careful, right? Because what is new, I think, in the Galileo I mean, Avi Loeb is Avi Loeb, yes, but Avi Loeb is not the Galileo project. And in the Galileo project, in fact, in their seminal paper of 2023, which is this 75-page text, right, which I consider to be an absolutely fundamental statement of the new science of this phenomenon, in an attempt to understand, in fact, what is the natural history with which we are dealing, right? And surely Greg's text operates at some right angle with respect to whatever natural history there is, and that will be a future interesting question to look at how these two things intersect. But what's crucial in that text, right, is that in fact the Galileo Project members, and it's a 15-20 author text, of which Wes Waters is the primary author. They made a consummate effort, a Herculean effort to examine the history of case reports to determine sort of what I would call phenomenological clusters, which are amenable to, and in fact inform the inner details of the research program in terms of the instruments that are required to observe these phenomenological clusters. So in fact, there is an interesting and important interrelationship between this new science and the history of the case reports, which is the sort of the staple of what I would call the classical ufological tradition. So in fact, it's historically informed, which is interesting.
No, you're quite right. I mean, and look, I've gone on record to being a bit critical of the some of the things that have been said on that count and about the use of the term UAP. But that said, I completely understand this idea that we use that historical record for just what you described, Mike. But then what we need to do is we need to start fresh. I get that. I get that argument to say that we can't go and, make very good judgments about the reliability of some of that data. So we're not going to do it. Let's do what we feel we can control. Now the question is, will they be able to do it? Will they find those sensors? Will they be able to make it all sort of come together in a way that is going to be more compelling than the predecessors? That's the $6 million question, right? But so I get that makes complete sense to me, actually. So.
And there we go back to the question of institutional stability that Mark and you guys were raising earlier. I don't want to vacuum all the time here. It's very rude of me to do that. We have a question. It's a rather long one. If I could interject here before anyone else. In fact, I think there are some others in the comments here that I will read after our colleague Michael Uhall's question. So firstly, he apologizes for its length, but he says, Greg, hi. I'm writing a book for Routledge about political theory, the geopolitics of outer space, and the extraterrestrial hypothesis, or ETH, as we call it. One of the chapters heavily involves the cultural history of ufology. I was wondering if you could speak a little but a little more about the difficulties you may have encountered in trying to research and study this type of source material. Specifically, I'm referring, Michael continues, to the fact that so much of the material is basically unverifiable, barring some kind of special access. By, quote, unverifiable here, however, I don't mean anything regarding claims about alien contact, UFOs, and so on. Rather, I'm referring superficially to more quotidian types of claims regarding events, interactions, personalities, and the like. As a colorful example, he gives us, take the case of Richard Doty, who figures, of course, prominently in the 1980s in popular ufology and its afterlives. The discourse around whom then, and to some extent now, is fantastically difficult to evaluate or even verify from a scholarly point of view. As scholars, how do you think it best for us to investigate and make sense of the host of anecdotally conflicting claims here, not just about the phenomena in question, UFOs and so on, but about basic elements and events in the social history, right, surrounding the phenomena, especially when archival or documentary evidence is lacking? And then he gives us an aside. I'm also writing a book about James Jesus Angleton, so we could also spin this question in terms of how to do work on the history of intelligence, given structural features to do with classification, overclassification, counterintelligence, information destruction, et cetera. In fact, this, I guess, Greg, touches on the question of sources, right? So if we can go back to that with Michael's question.
Yeah, no, those are important things to be dealing with. So yes, it is a challenge, in one way, it's not terribly unusual as a challenge. This is a common thing, actually, for the historian to be faced with this. It comes up with in all sorts of instances and examples. I was just recently listening to a paper of a very famous early modern Italian history colleague of mine, who was talking about the story of a famous Renaissance writer who clearly forged his own biography, and he was attacking other people who were forgers, and those forgers forged their own stuff, but they also were reporting on his true reality of his biography, and so on and so forth. A very common thing to be having to grapple with at a given period of time. And we're not even talking about forgeries here. We're just talking about, how do you trust the material and all? There's really two strategies you adopt. One is what we do as historians is we try as much as possible to never take one text or one source's word for it. Sometimes we only have that. And then what you do is you base it on the relative reliability you feel you have with that source or that text, given other things that it says. So you look for different kinds of signs and traces within the text or within that source that might lead you to lean one way or the other about it. Then the other strategy is it's the strategy of qualification of your statements, and it's about you teach or you write the question of verifiability into your writing. That is to say, if you have people at the time questioning somebody's version of reality, then you also report that, right? You give both, you give that, and maybe there's more than just one person who does that. So if you're talking about reconstructing a conversation that took place, or you're talking about somebody's version of how an interview went, and one person says, well, the interview went this way, and the other person says it went this way. What you'd like to do is incorporate all of those voices into the conversation. So you do it in that fashion. It means, therefore, that a history can sometimes be a pretty cacophonous. And at times I worry that this book might get a little too cacophonous because of that, but it's about the only way to do it, because it is a world of a lot of different voices and a lot of different memories.
Thank you, Greg. I have another question. Again, it's somewhat long in the comments. Let me see where it, Fiona McMillan asked, hi, Greg. You asked how a historian could deal with this topic. Here's one basic limitation, and I guess this is a comment. The categorization and separation of disciplines will not be successful in this case. The search for meaning and explanation must be interdisciplinary. Art and oral traditions must be honored as much as text. For example, Indian art records, so much more than the text in the history of the lived religion. My area of expertise is comparative theology and philosophy, and I came to this area when researching the phenomenology of spiritual and psychedelic experiences, altered states of consciousness, and the nature of consciousness. There are indeed great similarities between experiences of UAPs, ETs, religious experience, etc. Phenomenology is essential as a tool. Science is essential as well, as long as we recognize that science is based on assumptions and ideas that could be overturned if new paradigms are adopted. For example, there's an assumption that mind is an epiphenomenon. However, if mind created matter in different dimensions of reality, then both UAP and spiritual beings might be interconnected. I'm going to skip some of this. We cannot dismiss the phenomenon just because it does not fit into the current paradigm. Okay, I will read this book. Okay, it's just sort of the thank you and a comment. But I mean, is there a question in there, Greg, for you again, maybe about sources and about validating sources and so on? Do you think that? So I mean, for example, one question perhaps here, and I guess you kind of admitted that you didn't really base the history on oral interview, for example, which would be a very daunting task. But so your materials are, they're textual, right? So is there a history, I guess, to be done outside of this kind of source material, interviewing living witnesses, et cetera? And how do you, perhaps, is there a difference in the kind of history that's produced when you kind of seek these other sort of sources and then produce your work on that basis?
No, well, for starters, I would say I talked to a lot of people. I did do interviews, structured interviews, but a lot of it was the informal kind. I've talked to a lot of people, and a lot of people have communicated, as I pointed out, with me, unsolicited by me. And as I showed you, I do look at visual materials as well. I don't have a lot of time to go into them, but I try to talk a lot about the descriptions that people have given, and to give those recovery of those voices of descriptions as well in some of these pieces, these artworks that have been done, photographs, and the importance of photography in all of this. So I try to do my best, but yes, absolutely correct. You've got to look at multimedia as a really important thing and give it its due. I certainly agree with the study of this from an interdisciplinary perspective. I'm a big fan of that. I don't claim that history somehow has all the answers. It's just that we have something to contribute given our methods and our approaches to things. What I might push back on is this idea that looking at earlier periods of time and other phenomenon and anomalous phenomenon that need to be also integrated into this, that sort of begs the question of how does one know it's related to this? Why would one make the assumption that the UFO phenomenon and certain mystical experiences of Christian saints and certain experiences of you name it, ghosts in the ancient world or whatever? Why would we assume that these things are connected? So what I do is I make no claims that I'm trying to study all of those phenomenon or that these are all behind the UFO phenomenon. Rather, what I do is I take, again, historical actors at their word. And that is something distinctive socially happened with 1947 and onward. And a narrative and a perception got developed. I'm not saying it's right. I'm not saying it's wrong. But it got developed, it got crystallized, and it is relatively stable. That we are seeing contraptions that are real physical contraptions, that they are from outer space, or we suspect they're from outer space. Maybe later on other ideas get thrown out there. And that these things operate on principles that are strange and mysterious to us, and we want to unpack it, and we want to find a way to think about it and explore it. That is a very distinctive conversation. It's not to say it's right or wrong, and it could well be, as the commentator pointed out, that other things should be folded into it. Probably by the same merit, other things should be taken out of it, right? Because those rubrics, UFO, flying saucer, UAP, are messy. And so that's kind of the way I approached it and thought about it. Yeah.
I'm just going to sort of start interjecting until I see hands come up or someone interrupts. So Greg, yeah, I always go back to this question of the natural history, right? So is there an interesting point of comparison, for example, between the meteorite controversy? Meteors have been impacting the Earth, I mean, for as long as there has been an Earth. Oh, well, okay, not really, but for millions of years, presumably. And only in the late 18th and early 19th century did science finally, in a sense, for various sociological reasons that Ron Westrom many decades ago documents in his science and technology studies, right, on that and the UFO phenomenon. Finally, science kind of starts to wake up from it, accept these folk reports, and then sort of it dawns on them that there's a kind of a plausible ontology that can kind of fit these phenomena into a broader understanding of nature and the position of the Earth within this the structure of this natural cosmos. So, we don't know what the natural history of this stuff is. It's very noisy, as you point out. So what you're looking at is that entire social cultural system motivated, the sightings of which and the narrations of which are motivated by something, the nature of which is we just simply don't really understand how to ground that in something like a natural history. So that's an interesting. But we know what meteors are, right? I mean, we can go back and look at historical accounts of things seen in the sky, to quote Jung, right? And that kind of starts to change our understanding of what those accounts were, given what we now understand about the cosmos and about these stones that in fact do fall from the sky. So what would you say, Greg, there it's possible, perhaps now that a new science is trying to get started. Of course, we don't know how this is going to evolve. We here at the Society are trying to sustain that institutionally, professionally. But what if you could sort of, I opened up a space there, if you can sort of comment in that.
Yeah, no, the analogy has often been invoked, right? And it seems to me a fair one to sort of invoke in this context. Unless somebody can explain it to me, I can't see how history, the field of history, can possibly ever resolve the ontological question, which hopefully doesn't mean we're irrelevant, but I don't think it can do that. I don't think it's going to be the thing that finally sort of answers or resolves this matter one way or the other. So to me, as I think you and I have discussed before, so far, I don't know how I don't know that I see any reason to say that we have any reason to believe or to see evidence of UAP or UFOs to have a natural history without human beings, without our epistemology, without human beings' ways of categorizing and thinking about things outside of that. That doesn't mean they don't. It doesn't mean that they won't. It means right now we haven't been able to extricate that out from all the things that are about human history. If that point comes, then we can start to do exactly what you're describing. We can maybe start looking backward in time. But we also have to be careful. We have to be careful because not all past descriptions of things falling from the sky were of meteorites, right? Not all strange celestial observations or reports of observations were comets. Sometimes they were made up. Sometimes they were not meant to be taken literally, right? So the texts themselves can be very deceptive in that regard, and we forget that. We forget that people wrote for different reasons in different contexts. So that becomes a difficult venture, always being careful not to engage in anachronism as much as possible. But no, I fully, I try to recognize, and then when I talked about that article, I'd like to be able to write about historical methodology. Part of that will be to talk about the limits of historical method. What can't we do? What do you use and defer to others to do? And that's why while I say I agree with interdisciplinary research, I would also say I agree with maybe the better term is transdisciplinary research, in the sense of I do think disciplines have roles to play. I mean, I like the fact that there are people who have intensive, dense knowledge in physics and in engineering in ways that I don't have, and I never will have. And to me, it's important for me to hear those voices and hear those people with that knowledge and training. And that's part of what that conversation can be. And then hopefully then what we can do is get to a point where we bring all that to the table, and then what we can do is have that non-disciplinary conversation, which is the most difficult one, right? Where we try to leave our disciplines to the side and talk in a way, in a common language. Really a very hard thing to do, but important.
Greg, you're insistent on flying saucers as an important term of identifying, or at least locating, your social and cultural history. Why? Can you talk about that a bit? Because there's the name called,
yeah,
right? UFOs, now UAP, but you like flying saucers.
I do like flying saucers, but that's because I'm nostalgic. I'm a historian. I like the old school, the retro feel of it all. It sounds great. It resonates. It's suggestive in a way that's wonderful. I kind of like it. I like the birth and spread of it in an intriguing way. Flying saucer, it doesn't get created by military people. It wasn't created as an attempt to get generic or to study it in a serious way. It's a media concoction that then spreads like wildfire in the population. I like that. I like the fact that everyday people adopted it quickly and made it their own, and that I think is very cool. And so it's an aesthetic choice more than anything else.
I see. How? Please, hello. You have a question?
Hi.
Hello.
I have microphone switched off. You hear me? You hear me? Okay. Greg, I think that the point that this kind of things have to be some transdisciplinarity is a very powerful message to all. And let me get a parallel example of that in history field. I'm a historian, or better, I'm a storyteller. I consider myself not a historian, but a storyteller. You agree with the remarks that for you, Christopher Columbus, the correct name is Christopher Colon. Of course, is not his name, we know that, die believing and swearing that he reached Japan. You believe in that? It's a traditional current.
I don't know enough about the history of Columbus to say that. So I would I would defer to my colleagues who work in that area.
Okay. If you ask them, all of them will say that Column dies affirming, strongly affirm by his honor that they reached the Indies and Japan. Well, a well-known narrator of his last fourth voyage to America, better saying to Caribbean, Colon never put a foot in America. It's known his kidnapping by the indigenous people and the prophets that you don't me go loose and I will kill your god, the moon. In fact, Columbus supposedly, allegedly, had a manuscript of the astrological provisions for eclipses. In that date, that century, the eclipses are predicted by the Saros calculation. But there's this a point where all historians fail. I never see that point right in any book, any article. And I understand that this lack of transdisciplinarity causes that. The problem is, it is this. You can calculate with the Saros calculation from Greek and Assyrian times, the day exactly for the eclipses of the moon and the eclipses of the sun. But no historian think in one little point. How come Colon be in Jamaica? He knows that these eclipses will be visible in Jamaica. You understand? That's not possible. The Saros do not determine the point of observation. They only allows you to predict the day of the eclipse from the moon or from the sun. No historian noticed that, or he knows that in that day, at that hour, will be a moon eclipses, then he knows where he is. This is transdisciplinarity. Why? Because no historian that I know of catch this little detail in the diary of fourth voyage from Christopher's Colon to the Caribbean to Jamaica in this case, is explicit right old history. And the main historian that wrote that is living aside the time that Colon is alive. And he is the most trusted storyteller of the voyages of Colon. So it touches me very deep that Greg touched that hard point Without transdisciplinarity, these questions of VAPs or anomalous phenomena could not be solved if we can solve it. So I thank you very much for outstanding these, to me, important points. Overall, here in my country, at these days, we are living a situation where the minds are strictly closed to other areas of science. For instance, most of my friends, physicians, I have a background in physics also, don't consider history a science. They talk science, but what science you talking about? Physics, of course, chemistry, of course. So history is not a science. Well, not quite. So it's unbelievable because in the past century, the things are totally on reverse. There is more integration, interdisciplinarity, and people are not set apart between humanities and the so-called hard sciences. And if we storytellers, as me, have some difficulties to explain some phenomena, not like UAP, but phenomena like this simple question about colon. Nowadays, physics have more questions about
Howell, I'm sorry to interrupt you, but we're sort of like we're coming to the end of our time. So
I'm the end of my explanation.
All right, thank you. So is there anyone else that wants to jump in before we conclude? Mark, would you like to say any final remarks?
Yeah, you caught me by surprise, Mike. But
Sorry.
I will ask. This is not a fair question because maybe Greg doesn't like counterfactual history. Okay, yeah, but Greg, do historians always they fall into two clean camps? Either like it or you don't, or
yeah, some people don't like it, some people do, but I'm of the view that even when we say we're not doing it, we're doing it. You need counterfactuals in your head in order to be able to do the factual history. So
all right, well, so maybe my question will be fair.
Yeah.
And you can see where I'm probably going to go. Was there any chance, so you say you've got a chance, I've got a chance. Was there any chance that the history of the subject, and let's stick with the serious history, the stuff that we were trying to do at CUFOS and others were doing, could that have evolved in any other way, given all the forces in society, government, the intelligence agencies, right? The Cold War you write about, all the things that went on. How much of a chance was there that it really could have evolved differently? Or were we almost, and I know, looking back is easy to predict, were we fated to end up where we were in December of 2017?
Yeah, that's a great question. Could it have been otherwise? I remember in the archives, like a conversation. You probably are familiar with it. I think it's in Jacques Vallée's journals of maybe that first conversation between Alan Hynek and James McDonald, and McDonald is berating Hynek about how come you didn't get out in front of this thing. He said, and he claimed, right, early 50s would have been the time. If you had gotten in front of this, we could have set this thing up and had really serious scientific investigation. I don't know that I believe that's true back then. I don't think so. If I thought there could have been a moment, I think the moment was the Condon Committee in the 60s. Because of and the reason I think so is to see what happened after the Condon Committee was done and it announced its final report in '69. Is right. Condon says, no need to study this stuff, nothing of interest for natural scientists. But they do say, this stuff might be interesting to social scientists and people in the humanities if you want to study the beliefs of different groups of people, who are interested in UFOs. And up until that point, there've been a smattering of studies of UFO groups and stuff, right? A few famous ones, but not a lot of research done by social scientists about
Right.
UFOs in the UFO world. And then in the 1970s, it explodes, and they're all studying beliefs. So it's not to say that the Condon report created that wholly, but it definitely legitimated it. If the Condon Committee, even as skeptical as Condon was about all this stuff, had cracked the door open more, had actually given a certain stamp of approval for it, so that it would have allowed the new National Science Foundation to fund research, would have inspired academics who were in the Invisible College to come out and do things, I think you might have seen that might have been the great opportunity for something to have played out differently. And Alan Hynek, like as he was, Alan Hynek probably would have been in the forefront of that, right? He would have been one of the key figures helping build that infrastructure within academia.
Yeah.
So I had to think so. Yeah.
Yeah. No, I think that's right on point. I'll just add to that that in fact, because of the conclusions of the Condon report, and because of the 1973 wave, the Center for UFO Studies was formed by Alan Hynek because he saw because of Condon, the Blue Book closed, so the government wasn't looking into UFOs any longer. And then the '73 wave happened, and Hynek said, "Damn it, science has got to look into this, and I guess it has to be me." So,
yeah, exactly.
Hey, thanks again, Greg.
Thank you. Thanks, Mark, for the comments. Those were great. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you so much, Mark. Greg, as always, absolutely fascinating, a wonderful presentation. And we look forward to your next text. How many years? A year, 2 years? Can you give us a sense?
That's not going to happen, but you'll see some papers coming down the pike.
Good.
That's for sure. And you'll see some things, but it'll be a while. Anyway, thanks everybody. I really appreciate the comments and the attention. Thank you.
Thanks everybody. And on behalf of the Society, thank you everybody for attending, and we look forward to seeing you at our future events. Thank you. Good night. Good luck. Good morning, wherever you are in the world. You're welcome. Take care, everybody.
Thanks again, all.
See you.
Ciao.